So this is a class I did a while back on the International Churches of Christ, and I was asked to do it tonight again to kind of put into context. Most of us, we've been talking about it for a little bit now, just the news that came up and the lawsuit that was against the church, ICOC. And so we just wanted to give a little context again, for those who may have missed it the first time, just how the church is organized, what is our history? Again, because when you hear a lot of different things about, the church, specifically ICOC, it's good to kind of have that context. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. And so I'll do my best to get through as quickly as I can. But next slide, please. All right. So some of the things that you're going to hear, especially around when you start talking about ICOC, Church of Christ, you're going to hear two things. You're going to hear Mainline, and then you're going to hear ICOC. And so what's that whole Mainline thing about, right? So the International Churches of Christ has its roots in the Churches of Christ, right? And so as the campus ministry went on in the late 60s and 70s, that began to grow, and you began to see two churches really kind of come out of that, right? There was kind of a split, right? And so with that, you had charges of lukewarmness, there was some arrogance, there was a rift, that happened basically between Mainline and what became known as ICOC. This was before ICOC started, but this whole thing kind of began there. And so in 1993, the ICOC made a formal break from the Churches of Christ. And so in kind of the ICOC context, Mainline would be the old Churches of Christ, right? Those who did not associate or affiliate themselves with ICOC. And so that's kind of a high level. And we're going to dig a little deeper into kind of like, all right, what exactly happened here? Because the context happens to make a big difference. So next slide. Crossroads. And you'll hear a lot more about Crossroads. You'll even hear more maybe in the news about Crossroads, but next slide. We're going to start there because that's kind of the beginning. So in the 60s and 70s, around 1967, you had the 14th Street Church of Christ, and that was renamed to the Crossroads Church of Christ. Why is that important, right? Because you had Chuck Lucas there, and you'll hear that name's been in the news too, kind of associated with this whole thing here. But Chuck, as a minister here in this church, right, they had a real evangelical focus. They had prayer partners, soul talks. You'll hear about that stuff, and they started this campus crusade at the University of Florida. And what happened is it just exploded. It grew rapidly, right? But as it was growing, it grew, it got a lot of attention, right? And so not all of it favorable, right? So in 78, you had that Jonestown tragedy, and, the church got called a cult by the media, and that was addressed in the 78 bulletin back there at the Crossroads Church. But again, they had this kind of thing, this whole idea of, this Church of Christ, being a cult is not new, right? We've heard that in different ages along the way here. But the Soul Talks, by 79, there were 22 college men, 16 college women, about 5 adult men, 8 adult women, 8 young professionals, 15 professional women, 6 high schools. So you began to see that they began to break things down, right, to meet the needs. And so you had these little groups that were really, really flourishing, but this is kind of where it started here. Next slide. So 70s and 80s, you get this emphasis on the campus ministry, discipling, evangelism, diversity. And I know one of the things, you've got people here who went through Crossroads, and that was one of the main things that really drew people in, especially the folks who had been around Church of Christ before, is that when you went into the Crossroads Church, it was a diverse church. And it really attracted a lot of people, right? Because they looked at it and they said, wow, this is what I'm talking about. Because, honestly, the churches of Christ outside of that, they could be very specifically, kind of either black or white. But this was one where there was a lot of energy going on. It was growing, it was young people in there also, and it was diverse, and it really drew people in. And so you get this Church of Christ ministers from around the US started to go to Crossroads because they wanted to see what was going on. They heard about it. They saw how it was growing. They saw the excitement around it. And so they wanted to come and learn. And so they came from around the country to go to Crossroads to kind of see what was happening. And so Kip McKean was baptized in Crossroads, and he was mentored by Chuck Lewis. Now, that Kip McKean will be a main figure as we go on, and you'll see. And the campus ministry grew. Kip was a part of that. Kip and Elena, got together there in Crossroads. But really, Kip, under his leadership, this campus ministry really just continued to flourish like crazy. And so Kip and Elena, they leave Crossroads and they go to Boston in the Lexington Church in Boston. Right? Next slide, please. So with that move, right, from Crossroads up into Boston, this is really the early stages of what was known as the Boston movement, right? So they had their first meeting in '79, that was with the Lexington Church, Kip and Elena, Gloria, Al Baird, and others, Pat Gemple, Bob and Pat Gemple. They met together in the living room. Basically, that's how kind of small this group was getting together here, as far as the leadership team. And by 1980, Kip became the evangelist for the Lexington Church of Christ, right? So you can see that, Elena and Kip moved from Crossroads, they go into Boston, and they start leading this church. And by May 1980, Steve Johnson was added as an evangelist. Again, taking the same model from Crossroads, you get soul talks, and you get, Kip is a leader, Elena is leading, Lisa, Steve, Doug Arthur, Jim Lloyd, Pat Gemple. So they're leading these soul talks. And again, very much the kind of the same thing. It's growing, right? It's flourishing. And in 1980, they had the Summer Spiritual Enrichment Weekend. And that was with Jerry Jones and Chuck Lucas. And that's kind of important because the link is still there between Crossroads and what's going on in Boston, right? Because again, Kip came from Crossroads. That's where he kind of learned this ministry style, and it took off here at the Lexington Church. Next slide, please. So in '81, you get the discipleship study. And so you begin to see the formulation of the studies that, kind of we use today. In '82, the Boston School of World Mission was started, and Kip is the director of that. In '82, you also get the first annual Boston World Mission Seminar, and that was titled Into All the World. And you'll see why some of these things link later on. And in September of '83, the Lexington Church of Christ was renamed to the Boston Church of Christ. Again, so you see that, again, this foundational changes here, and what we call the Boston Church, this is where it began, right? And so in '86, you get this, reconstructions begin, right? And so what's the reconstruction? So you have this model church here now that started in Boston, the Boston Church. And so the goal of this reconstruction was to really to look at other churches of Christ and be able to send people there to really help them take on the same model that was going on in Boston, right? So Jerry Jones leads the Boston movement, right? Because again, you begin to see some of the fracturing here between, what was Crossroads and what became, Boston Church of Christ. And then you get this remnant doctrine, right? And then you get this break with the COC and the break with Crossroads here. So the remnant doctrine. So this was an idea of that out of all the churches that, if you read in the Bible, it talks about how you got this remnant, this Israel, the remnant of Israel, right? So the same kind of concept where, you've got this bigger, group of churches, but God has a remnant. Out of all of these churches, there's a remnant. And the remnant really becomes this Boston movement. If you go to the next slide, please. And so the idea of the remnant, this Boston movement becoming the remnant of what God is going to do, and sending churches out to either start new churches or help to reconstruct churches. And you begin to see how the church plantings go, and you begin to see the ICOC take form, right? And so at 82, this is all the churches coming out of Boston now that folks leave Boston and go to lead ministries kind of in these different places. You got Chicago in 82, London, right behind that is New York City. Then you've got Toronto, Singapore, Hong Kong, LA in 89, Honolulu, and then Florida. And so again, you begin to see this movement take on, this whole idea of what we talked about before into all the world. This is what it was about. It's about, okay, let's take this model that we have here and let's spread this out across the world. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all the numbers here, but basically you can get from the graphs, right, that you can see like from when it started to as the churches began to grow, and you can see the total number of churches shooting up, the total number of nations is shooting up. You get the number of churches, the church attendance is like exploding. Average weekly attendance is exploding. And again, there was a focus on the numbers, right? To show that, look, yeah, this movement is it. This is what God is blessing. Look at it growing. And it did grow. I mean, the church grew tremendously with that focus. Next slide, please. And again, if you go to the history by the numbers, again, you can see how this same movement, all right, so you're thinking of, ICOC now, in the early days, again, this rapid growth of the number of people coming out to church, number of people getting baptized, the number of churches being planted around the world. And the movement is growing like crazy. Next slide, please. So, like Men Who Dream, right? So this is basically an article that, that was in the LA church, kind of really recapping kind of the history, right, of the movement. And again, you can see, over the years how things had grown. And so this was basically an article coming from the Gempels, Bob Gempel, and other folks, put in, but this is basically Bob Gempel kind of talking here. And as you read through it, you begin to see, okay, what is the focus, right, of the movement? And it really is about evangelism, growth, discipleship, and the idea of, that this is God's movement, ICOC, right? And so I'm just going to highlight just a little paragraph here, right? So he's writing, and if you see here, it says that there have been battles, and it says they've eventually led to the breaking away from the traditional church and the formation of the international churches of Christ. Bob goes on, he says, I've been keenly disappointed that most in this mainline group, particularly those involved in the bus ministry, campus ministry, and Christian colleges, did not catch the vision and abandon their traditions that have blinded them to what could be. I pray for them and again challenge them to join us in God's most exciting dream of all, an evangelized world in this generation. Okay, so that was kind of the focus. Also, again, we talked about how the focus was on evangelism and growth, but you also see the seeds of like what's going on with the split, right? And there were some hard things said between ICOC and some of the mainline churches. And again, when you think ICOC, think of it as the entity of ICOC. I'm not talking about all the members. Every member may have had different ideas. I know that for sure. But there was a real difference about, like, if you were not in ICOC and were you a Christian, right? Because again, this was the remnant, and some hard things were said. Next slide, please. And so when you take a look at it here, the church, again, they were talking about taking it all into all the world. They also wanted to focus on reaching everybody in the one generation. So you get this evangelization proclamation. And so that was in 94, and that was to evangelize the world in one generation, right? And so in 95, you had these short-term goals, and they were establishing by the year 2000, a true church of disciples in every nation of the world with a city of over 100,000 souls. Again, key in on the words here, right? A true church of disciples in every city with over 100,000 souls. It's going to become important. And you can see how the leadership style was of the ICOC at this point. Kip and Elena, they were at the head of it, right? And so different evangelists throughout, you had the ACEs, which was kind of New York and this area here. And they basically broke up the areas of the world into these, with these leadership teams. And basically all these leadership teams really just took the advice. Kip was leading everything. Kip and Elena, they were like at the top. Everybody was he was pretty much given the direction for all of the churches. And it was a Kip-led movement, right? That was back then. This is how ICOC was. Next slide, please. So things begin to change. Next slide. So you get these early signs of dysfunction, right? And so in 99, the ICOC had like a tipping point in the growth, right? Where the number of members coming in and the number of members leaving, like the number of members leaving was actually growing, and then it was getting to a point like, okay, there's a problem here. Something's going on. And you can get more on this from Andy Fleming's, article here. Let each one be careful how he builds. But folks were leaving, ICOC was focusing on people coming in, wasn't talking so much about the people leaving, but the folks who were in it were looking at it and said, okay, there's something going on. And in 2002, the Boston Church of Christ, their leadership actually issued an apology. And this was some of the things that they looked at and they said, we got issues. And they said, as leaders, we failed to meet the needs of the members. The organizational structure is out of date. Decision makers have lost contact with the people. The most experienced leaders are leading only leaders. Sending out mission teams have disrupted relationships. The structure has produced a second line of leaders who simply await direction rather than taking initiative. And again, going back to the structure that we were taking a look at, Kip's leading everything. Folks are being pulled from different churches to go start these other churches. And they realized in Boston here early on in 2002, it's wrong. That there needs to be a change here, right? Next slide, please. And so we go on from there and you begin to see that, in LA, Kip and Elena and McKean, they announced that they're stepping down from leadership, taking a sabbatical because of, and this was their words, serious shortcomings in our marriage and family. And the Beards and the Gempels, they wrote like, certainly we are saddened by their shortcomings, talking about Kip and Elena and the vital areas of marriage and family, but we are also saddened by our own failure to have given them all the help they needed in these areas. And so the Beards and the Gempels continue working with the McKeans, but in 2002, the McKeans were asked to step down from any leadership in the ICOC. That did not go well. In 2006, Kip and Elena leave the ICOC and they start their own movement, International Christian Churches. right? So again, for context, people can kind of still link Kip to ICOC, and which he was a main focus of it starting and how it spread. But obviously there was a breakdown here, and I think from everything that I've seen and I've read, that one of the major contentions with Kip is that, again, Kip thought he should be leading the movement, and that folks would come to him for his leadership, and then that would kind of be disseminated down. So you had this hierarchy. And you can see from the Boston church that they were like, no, there's something wrong with that. The interesting thing from these statements, though, from Kip and Elena and even the Bears and the Gempels, right? And not taking anything away. Like, a lot of people got saved. And the movement did a lot of great things. But here they're talking about family, and they're not talking about the organization and how things were wrong. They're not really addressing the stuff that Boston talked about. And that's going to become an issue later on too. Let's go to the next slide. So in 2003, you'll hear about the Henry Kriete letter, Honest to God. And this was a major turning point in ICOC. So Henry Kriete, an evangelist in the London Church of Christ, and he wrote an open letter, right? Now, people can debate whether it should have been open or should have been addressed, to the leadership. That can be debated, but it was an open letter. And he talked about 4 systemic evils: the corrupted hierarchy, which we talked about, the obsession with numbers, arrogance, and the seduction by money, right? And so those were the 4 things. If you take a look at all of the stuff that was going on that everybody was really excited about, and you could be excited about it, but it's like not just growing. It's like, well, how are you doing it? Like, what's behind all of that? And that hierarchy of Kip being at the head of everything, running everything, and everybody else, you get this layered hierarchy. Henry pointed it out as corrupt. That's something that also really kind of relates back to what Boston talks about. It talks about the obsession with numbers. It was about how many people are you baptizing? How many people, how's your church growing? And a lot of how you got measured, whether it was success or not, was around numbers. The arrogance was about us being that remnant, as far as talking about ICOC, that not only is ICOC the remnant, but ICOC is the only church, right? That arrogance. And then the seduction by money, because the 2 things you really looked at, okay, is how's your church growing? Not only by people getting baptized, but where's your contribution and how's that going? And he said that all these structural systemic evils are entangled and intertwined. They will continue throughout our churches until universally and officially addressed. Next slide, please. So what kind of came out of that? We had different apologies, right? LA church leadership talked about arrogance in the staff, weakening other churches, weakening the other churches by taking leaders and moving them around, giving through compulsion. You get that phone call about, are you giving? Or are you making sure you're making your different special contributions? It was tough. The authoritarian discipling, improper teaching of the true church, not emphasizing the greatest commandment, not fulfilling the role of elders, abusive accountability, not teaching the Bible in depth, discouraging older disciples. This is what came out of the LA church. It's not like my opinion. This is what they wrote. This is the stuff that they were apologizing for. Next slide, please. And so the consequences. So those of us who went through that time, we know it well. But about 1/3 of the members leave the ICOC, right? So you go from about 135,000 worldwide to about 88. And out of that, there was individual trauma, and you got a mass exodus of leaders, right? And so a lot of the things that you might hear in the news about ICOC, a lot of this is like in the past. Not that it happened, different things happen. Like, I can't comment on the lawsuit because that all still needs to all be, brought out. But there was a lot of stuff going on that was not good. And the consequences of that letter coming out rocked the ICOC. Next slide, please. And so out of all of that, we need to take a look. Okay, so where are we today, right? Because even as I talk to people, even they've been around for a while, they don't really understand how ICOC has changed from that point to kind of today. And so next slide. And so it went from this hierarchy to church cooperation. And so this is important because this is kind of how this is where it began of kind of where we are today. And so a paper was written and it was put out about, okay, this is how ICOC is going to move forward, right? And so it says here, the purpose of the following paper, that was the paper that they sent out, is to affirm and enhance the unity of the family of churches known since '92 as the International Churches of Christ in early September of 2005. During a forum organized by 2005 International Leadership Conference, coordinated in Seattle, we got together with 9 brothers, were elected by ballot to serve as a unity proposal group. They left Seattle with a clear charge from commended brothers to present a proposal to our churches that would further cooperation, unity, and missions throughout our fellowship. And so this is the key. I mean, it was, the letter had a lot in it, but this is what I took out because I think this is really at the heart of it. It says, we have no desire with this process to formulate judgments about any of those in other fellowships. That was key because that was part of the arrogance that was spread through ICOC earlier on. We agree that we are not the only Christians, but are Christians only. That was major because a lot of what was coming out of ICOC was we are the only Christians. And they, as a church group, for ICOC to kind of continue, this had to be made clear to get past that arrogance that we are not the only Christians, but are Christians only. The design of this plan is to strengthen the bonds between some 500 churches that share a common history and heritage so that we might continue on our journey together in faithfulness to God on the way to heaven. Additionally, we originally thought the document might be somewhat shorter, but became convinced during this process that the present length was necessary for clarity and fullness. And again, I just took this out, but basically go from the hierarchy to like, okay, we don't have one person leading ICOC anymore. What we have is a cooperation of all of the churches. And if you go to the next slide, we'll get into that a little more. So this is actually from today. And I have a link here. And if you go there, there is a video about, that was recently made about, how the ICOC is organized right now. But there's 731 churches in 147 countries. It's starting to grow with 15.5% 10-year growth, 114,000 members right now. So the key to that is that you see these 34 regional families of churches. And so again, you have these churches that are members of the ICOC. So, but how do you cooperate? How do you get together and say, okay, we're ICOC, we're churches, this ICO church, International Churches of Christ, but how do we keep our bond of the fellowship since there is no hierarchy? And so what was agreed to is that each of the churches would kind of form families together, and then they would send delegates, and then they would have meetings, and the churches, they would get together and they would talk and they would say, okay, what do we think? How are things going? What are we doing? And let's see how we can stay unified as churches rather than everybody breaking off and kind of doing, you can still basically do your own thing, but how do we combine and talk about what we're doing? So when they say ICOC, this fellowship of churches, there are some basic things that we all have in common that we've agreed to. You don't have to be in lockstep. Churches can kind of decide how they're going to be organized, but there was an agreement that we do need to cooperate, right? And so within that, you've got, like, on the larger level, you've got these, church delegates, but you also have these service teams, right? Because again, there's needs across all of the fellowships. And so you pull the elders in from all these different churches, and you have some representatives there, and you have teachers, you've got the women's ministry, campus, singles, youth and family. And then you have this catalyst team, which basically, okay, we've got these different things, how do we implement it? And so now you don't have a hierarchy anymore. You have a cooperation of these churches. And that's where we are today. And so when people say, okay, the ICOC did this or ICOC did that, we got to think about it as the churches are individual. Yeah, we cooperate, but there's not one person saying, okay, this is how you do it. Or there's one monolithic structure, that we all tie into. And it's just like ICOC. ICOC is a cooperation of churches. And different churches do things different ways. We have some basic fundamental things that we stand on, but it's not this same, okay, it has to be done this way. The word's going to come down from some leader in ICOC, and then all the churches have to do it. That's not the way it works anymore. That is not it. The focus has gotten away from, just about, growth and money and, moving away from all of that, right? And still moving on. Next slide, please. And so this to me was just like amazing, right? Because again, today, 2019, ICOC Gainesville Christian Church and the Campus Church of Christ, formerly known as Crossroads, came together and started to build their relationships. And they decided that they would be better together than apart. And so one of the sister churches there in Gainesville sold their building, and now they meet together with Crossroads Church in one building, and they're going to focus on the University of Florida. And this is basically going back to where everything began. And so, I mean, there was some real hard feelings, right, between Mainline, like we talked about this beginning here of this Crossroads Church, Campus Crusade, and ICOC, to the point now in 2019, they can sit down and they can talk in this new environment that's been created here for a while now and actually come together. Like, Mainline, quote unquote, and ICOC together, right? Because that old ICOC does not exist anymore. That whole way of thinking does not exist anymore. And that opened the way up for feelings to be healed and for us to grow closer to all the other Christian churches, whether they're honestly Church of Christ or not, on the door. It's like, what are you teaching? What are you about? Right? But for this to happen, this is God. This is God. For Crossroads and ICOC to be together and back starting again, basically to what God was looking to do, I think, from the beginning, to me is amazing. This is really good news. Next slide, please. So I'll give my takeaways. And again, the stuff before is pretty much history, right? I mean, you can go out to the church website and ICOC website. You can get a lot of history. Not really, so much my opinion. But when I look at it, and again, I was baptized in '86. So I've been around a little while. I've known Steve Johnson. I've sat in meetings with McKean, and so I've been in the ministry, been around a minute. But this is what I take away when I take it out and I look back. John 3:26-30. Key here, he must become greater, I must become less. The church has got to be about Jesus. It's got to be. When it becomes about you rather than Jesus, you're done. You're done. The pride has taken over, and when I look at it, it became about one person, and rather than that one person becoming less and Jesus becoming more, that other person became great. You got to watch, and especially leaders, you got to watch your head, because if it gets too big and you focus on just that, you get to Philippians 2:3-4, do nothing out of vain ambition. Who are you doing it for? What is it all about? Matthew 7:21-23, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. See, bottom line, we need to be doing what God says. And I don't care who it is, that if they're not looking at the Bible and doing what the Bible says, and they've decided to kind of distort it or twist it or whatever, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, is getting in. It is just like, are we following Jesus? Are we listening to God's word? And that's for all of us. Like, one of the things that we could take a look back at, and you can see that, the elders who were there with Kip, they were saying they were apologizing because they felt like they weren't in their lives enough. That should not be, right? Everybody needs somebody in their life to help them, to guide them, to hold them accountable to following Jesus. And quite frankly, the more responsibility you have, the more you need it. The more you need it, because power can corrupt. Absolutely. And absolute power, like they say, will corrupt. Absolutely. The more responsibility you have, the more you stand in front of some people, you need people in your life to hold you accountable, to keep you humble, to keep you on track, because Satan will be after you. The last piece, we are all still writing our history. And I mean, we are. We can't leave God's church just up to the leaders. God's church does not have this lady, where you got the church people and you got everybody else, and everybody else is just waiting to see what the church leaders say. Everybody has a role. And it's important for you to understand your role. But the fact is, we're family, and in a family, you've got different roles, but that doesn't mean we don't participate. And so it's about we, not just them. It's about we. And it's about having that open conversation, and to realize that ICOC, even in this form that we are now, it's not done. It's not like, okay, we've arrived and there's nothing else to do. No, that the church needs to continually go and look back and talk about, why do we do what we do? Why are we doing it this way? Constantly going back to the Bible and taking a look and say, look, have we strayed? Have we missed the mark? Is there something we need to do? Again, not to be in step with society, because the church will never be in step with society. Are we in step with God's word? We've got to constantly strive to do that. And that is a we thing. Now, again, there are different responsibilities. You've got your elders, you've got your teachers, you've got your evangelists, you've got your deacons. But trust me, I don't think we're going to get and stand in front of God and go like, well, the elder told me, and my evangelist said. No, that's going to be on them. But what you do and how you obey the Bible, that's on you. And that's on us. So it's a we thing. Again, this is my takeaways. Next slide, please. Thank you. Thanks for giving me the time. And let's keep praying for our church.